Welcome back to Pod Save the World. I'm Tommy Vietor.
I'm Ben Rhodes.
Here we are, Ben, back in lockdown officially. I'm not going to complain about lockdown this time, 'cause I don't want people to think that I'm being a baby about it. Actually, we have some good news, I think, on the pandemic later in the show. So hopefully that will bring everybody's spirits up. That's the goal today, Ben. We're going to bring up spirits, lift them.
Yeah, there's light at the end of the tunnel, just
light
like
at
the
the end
Trump
of the tunnel.
presidency.
So we got a lot going on today. We have a Secretary of Defense nomination. We have a threat by President Trump to veto money for the troops. We're going to talk about whether or not Elizabeth Warren is secretly running Argentina. I'll explain civilian casualties in Afghanistan, why Mike Pompeo is still an asshole, a COVID update, China sending spies to the Bay Area, aliens, and then the Olympics. So let's start with Joe Biden's selection for Secretary of Defense, because that was the big news this week. So he has chosen retired four-star General Lloyd Austin to be his nominee for Secretary of Defense. And if confirmed, Austin would be the first black Secretary of Defense in history, which is a very big deal. But the selection has also generated some controversy, because Austin hasn't been retired from the military for 7 years, as is required by law. I think he's been out for 4. So more on that in a bit. Austin had a distinguished career in the Army. He served as commander of U.S. Central Command. He was the last commanding general in Iraq. He's a West Point grad. Politico broke this news, and they noted that Austin has a lot of experience in logistics management, which will be really important for the COVID vaccine distribution process. And he also got close to Biden back in 2011, because Biden at the time was running Iraq policy from the White House, especially trying to get all the troops home. Austin was the commanding general. They got to know each other well. Biden was flying to Iraq all the time. So, Ben, like, pros for Austin, right? He's widely respected. He has combat experience. He has experience in Iraq. He has experience leading efforts against ISIS. He's got a relationship with Biden. He would be this historic first to hold a job that is way too white at the top. Downsides for Austin are this waiver issue that I mentioned earlier, and the concern about the balance between civilian authority versus military authority. In fact, this concern is so serious that Senator Jack Reed, who is a senior Democrat on the Armed Services Committee, says he will not support a waiver for any future nominee for defense secretary. So it seems like the nomination could be in a little bit of trouble, and there's some criticism and blowback. Austin has also faced some criticism for being on the board of Raytheon, which is a defense contractor. So, Ben, there are probably some people listening to us talk about this who are like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, why is recent military service a negative in this job? That makes no sense. It seems like that'd be the exact thing you want from a Secretary of Defense. An exception was made recently for this waiver rule for General Mattis, who is Trump's first Secretary of Defense. He was confirmed overwhelmingly. Can you step back and kind of help people understand the controversy here and the concern about preserving civilian control of the military?
Yeah, first of all, I think Lloyd Austin is an extraordinary guy. There are a few generals that were in the Situation Room more, because of Iraq, because of CENTCOM and the counter-ISIS mission than him. Just a man of tremendous integrity. So I think it's important to lay that down, because I do have a couple of concerns.
Yeah.
In terms of civilian control, I think it comes from a couple of dynamics. The first is that the U.S. military is just an incredibly powerful institution, the uniformed military, that has its own interests. And I think there's always been a concern that if you don't have a civilian in that position, that the momentum of the military's own interests in resources or in certain policies could kind of overtake, what should be judgments that are made weighing a variety of different priorities. I'll give you an example so this becomes more real to people. The Afghan surge, which we've talked about a lot on this show. General McChrystal becomes the field general in Afghanistan. He decides that he needs 40,000 additional U.S. troops. The U.S. military, you'll recall, Tommy, kind of fell in line around the general. So whether it was Mike Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, or Dave Petraeus, the head of Central Command at that time, who was above McChrystal in the chain of command, uniformly just took the same position. And I think that this is the danger, right? That the military, when they're in wars, they want more resources for understandable reasons, right? They want to do the job that's been put in front of them. The question is, when you're dealing with like a $700 or $800 billion budget, for instance, do you have a Secretary of Defense who can look at that from a civilian perspective and say, maybe we don't need those additional weapon systems, or maybe I need to listen to the president who's telling me that we've got an economic crisis in this country, so we have to make some cuts in the defense budget.
Yep.
And so I think on issues like, are there more resources put into counterterrorism or wars? Or are we going to be able to cut the defense budget? Those are just two examples of circumstances where somebody who's spent their whole life in uniform might be much more likely to kind of represent the views of the uniformed military rather than asserting the kind of civilian control of the military that allows you to make trade-offs, that allows you to weigh resource requests in one area against other national priorities, and that just frankly just has a healthy dynamic in democracies. You don't want militaries to be in positions of political influence. You want them to be, carrying out their professional responsibilities.
Yeah. It's also probably pretty challenging. If you're a 4-star general, you are the best of the best of the best of the best, right? And that is an elite club. And I imagine you spend 40 years in the military with a bunch of 4-stars, you become pretty close. So to your point, I mean, having to push back on them on behalf of the White House to implement policy, I think becomes even harder. And that's probably why this would only be the third time that a president has requested or received a waiver. The first was George Marshall in 1950, and then General Mattis in the beginning of Trump's term in 2016. Unfortunately, we're talking about this question of sort of civilian control of the military, right? And we're not having a conversation about how progressive this choice is, right? Like, I have no idea what Lloyd Austin's politics are, but I suspect, like you said, he's not going to be a person who's going to come to the building and push for budget cuts and say, like, $741 billion NDAA is a lot of money. But, like, I guess the question is, who would be that more progressive alternative? Because I don't know that Michelle Flournoy is that person either, right? I mean, she supported, the Iraq surge. Like, she's someone who's got unbelievable experience. She's a brilliant thinker. She has been recommended by, almost everybody that is steeped in these policies. But again, it's sort of like, to your point, Ben, like, not someone that's gonna, shake up the building really.
Well, yeah, but I'll say this, because if my first concern with the selection is the civilian control, the military point. The second is, this will be the third consecutive time that a Democrat has won a presidential election and then not chosen a Democrat to be their Secretary of Defense. And I look, I don't know, maybe Lloyd Austin, I'm not suggesting he's a Republican. I think, understandably, he's probably of no political party affiliation because he spent his career in the military, and that's right. So it's not a criticism of Lloyd Austin. The point is, Barack Obama wins in 2008 and names Bob Gates. Barack Obama wins in 2012 and names Chuck Hagel. Joe Biden wins in 2020 and chooses Lloyd Austin. It just feels like, why are we afraid to pick a Democrat? There's a lot of Democrats in this country. And so, yeah, Michelle, I'm sure there are important progressive arguments about where Michelle's been on certain policy issues or the budget. But we do know that she's been a Democrat, and she's been, she understands the Democratic Party, and she understands the Democratic concerns in Congress. So not that she's the ideal alternative, but rather that I would like to see a civilian and a Democrat serve a Democratic president at some point. And because it reinforces kind of the Republican narrative that Democrats aren't ready or somehow serious about national defense and the military. If we kind of confirm that view by picking a general or by picking a Republican like Gates or a Republican like Hagel, as if we have to be viewing this position from a defensive crouch, right. That's what bothers me the most about this pick, again, which has nothing to do with Lloyd Austin. Like, he could be the greatest general in the world, but the reality is, the Republicans appoint people that are going to carry out their national security priorities for better, good, bad, or ugly. I'd like to see the Democrats pick somebody from our own bench, really, for these types of positions.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I'm kind of playing devil's advocate here. Like, I'm sure Lloyd Austin and Michelle Flournoy would be exceptionally good at the job. I'm just sort of struck by how narrow the sort of boundaries of the conversation are going in. That's
a good point, Tommy, which is like, you don't see progressives on these lists ever. So it is something to think about in terms of how you're developing your bench.
Whereas, Trump sends Mike Pompeo to the State Department, right, from the CIA, who is like a military first, kill everything, diplomacy later kind of guy, and not a great pick. Ben, random story that came to mind, I was thinking about Jim Jeffrey and Lloyd Austin, who were like kind of like the diplomat and the senior military leader, tag teaming the Iraq drawdown process. were you in that deputies committee meeting when Dennis was leading it, and he had asked Jim Jeffrey, the ambassador, about some sort of document, and Jeffrey was like, "Oh, we'll send that over to you when it's ready." And Dennis said, "Oh, no, we have it here, actually. Like, so-and-so from your team sent it over to us. So, thank you for that." And Jeffrey in Baghdad forgot to mute his mic. And he was like, "Get me that motherfucker!" He went berserk. And he didn't know he wasn't muted. And we're all sitting there in the Situation Room. Like, everyone is dying laughing. And like, Dennis like, Jim, your mic.
Yeah, Jim Jeffrey didn't love the Obama White House either, so that kind of came out too. I'll tell you, Lloyd Austin. I mean, that guy is super intense. I mean, he's like 6'6" and like just a big guy with like a deep baritone voice. And it was really intense to be in the counter-ISIL meetings with him because he would refer to ISIS as the singular he, as the enemy. So he'd be describing like, be like, so the enemy you see, he's over here and we're going to hit him here. And it was always like the toughest thing imaginable. Like this general just describing like, in this kind of first person way, how he was going to take out ISIS. And I will say, like, he was the guy who put together, from the military perspective, this, coalition of dozens of countries that ultimately did take out ISIS. I will say it should be looked at, right? The failure of that probably ill-considered to begin with train and equip program of the Syrian opposition happened under Austin's command. Again, that the failure may very well have been with the civilians who provided that mission, but that's something that may get scrutiny. And there was some question that I hope gets surfaced here about civilian casualty reporting from CENTCOM at the time Austin was there. Again, not suggesting that he was personally responsible for this, but I think it's important that issues like transparency around civilian casualties get an airing in a confirmation process. Obviously they've not featured at all in the last 4 years with Trump. But I think having come out of a period with McMaster and Kelly and Mattis, it would have been even more important to kind of, send a message about civilian control. But I mean, look, Joe Biden clearly is prioritizing people that he is personally very comfortable with. And I can attest firsthand, he thinks the world of Lloyd Austin and that's the kind of team he wants. And that's, he's entitled to his team, and they are all high quality people.
Yeah, for sure. So, one thing that will be very relevant to whoever gets this job, whether it's Flournoy or Austin or anybody else, is the annual National Defense Authorization Act. So that is a literally $741 billion bill this year that funds military programs, weapons systems, pay raises, other compensation for service members. Trump has repeatedly tweeted various veto threats around this bill, including if it doesn't include a repeal of Section 230, which is a federal law that gives social media companies like Twitter and Facebook liability protections. Basically, if I tweet something terrible, Twitter can't be sued, but I can. That's the gist of it. There is a reasonable debate that should be had about liability protections and social media platforms and et cetera. But what Trump is doing here is saying that he will cut off funding to the U.S. military because Twitter won't let him spread lies about the election without fact checks, which is obviously a petulant, ridiculous thing to do. So previously, he threatened to veto this bill because of a provision from Elizabeth Warren that would change the names of 10 military bases that are currently named after Confederate generals, because maybe we should stop honoring Confederates. This morning, Trump said another tweet that also added, quote, "The bill must allow for 5G and troop reductions in foreign lands." Now, of course, he spelled troop, T-R-O-U-P-E, the way you would a dance troupe, comedy troupe. I guess what he's referencing are parts of the current bill that limits his ability to reduce the number of troops in Germany and South Korea. And then there's something I don't really understand about GPS and 5G, but whatever. So, Ben, I mean, the politics of this are just unimaginably stupid. I mean, cutting off funds for the U.S. military because Twitter is mean to you, that's just not a great message. You can't ever convince me that is. The House passed the NDAA anyway today, Tuesday. Over the summer, versions of the bill had passed with veto-proof majorities. The question now is whether Republicans are going to fall in line one last time or just ignore him. There's rumblings out of the Freedom Caucus that they will support a Trump veto. What do you make of this madness, this 11th hour madness, and like care to make a prediction about what happens here?
Well, it's completely insane reason to be vetoing the National Defense Authorization Act. First of all, even if you have concerns about Section 230, right, and you want greater tech regulation, like the NDAA is not like the vehicle through which I'd be addressing that. Like, let the new Congress take that up, And you're right about the politics. Like, if a Democrat was, Obama, every time the NDAA came up, they would always have restrictions in the NDAA, basically preventing him from closing Gitmo, right? So the laws that said you couldn't transfer anybody out of Gitmo into the U.S., even to a prison here. And we would always kind of consider vetoing it, and the kind of collective wisdom of Democrats in Congress and the media was it's political suicide and insanity to possibly veto an NDAA. You'll never recover from it, blah, blah, blah. So there's clearly a double standard here. And the Freedom Caucus seems to indicate that they're going to have his back. So as usual, Trump, not surprising that he's acting like a toddler on the way out, who doesn't care about, the defense of the United States. It's just a shock that why are Republicans backing up a lame duck president on a bunch of insane pet projects of his, I would assume that this veto will be overturned. But if enough, House Republicans are still, paying homage to dear leader, this could all get punted to next year, in which case, they'll just pass an NDA very quickly, I think, through the next Congress under Joe Biden.
Just an absurd number of things that are being held hostage to this man's ego. It is just infuriating. Okay, so Argentina. So this is the reason I mentioned Elizabeth Warren. So Argentina passed a new tax on its wealthiest citizens to pay for COVID relief measures. So this is a tax on people worth more than $2.5 million, which the BBC estimated would impact about 12,000 people in the country. And so it's a rate of up to 3.5% on wealth in Argentina and 5.25% on wealth outside of Argentina. They are hoping to raise about $3.7 billion, so about like a 50th of a Bezos, and use that money to pay for actual medical supplies as well as relief for businesses and people. And then I think like a fifth of it is going to go towards developing a domestic natural gas sector, which is kind of random, but who knows? So anyway, this seems like a good idea. We should do this.
Yeah.
How about a wealth tax?
Great idea. I'd love to see Elizabeth Warren's proposals globalized. This is, and look, I will say Argentina, like a lot of Latin American countries, struggles with massive economic inequality. I mean, destabilizing inequality. And that's fueled protests next door to Argentina and Chile. And now we've got a progressive president in Argentina doing, I think, what is a very common sense thing and raising badly needed resources in the middle of COVID and economic crisis through a wealth tax. The thing I'd watch, Tommy, is whether this becomes contagious in a good way, where government after government starts to see that this is an equitable way to try to address public needs.
It would be a good thing. So you mentioned the issue of civilian casualties in CENTCOM earlier. So I wanted to raise that issue about Afghanistan because Brown University has a cost of war project, and they just recently released it. And they found that in 2019, U.S. airstrikes killed more civilians in Afghanistan than any other year since 2002, since the beginning of the war. There was a 330% increase from 2016 to 2019. So 2016 was the last full year Obama was in charge. So 330% increase from the Obama years to the most recent Trump year. The increase is directly attributable to a decision made in 2017 by the Trump team to loosen the rules of engagement for airstrikes. So for listeners unfamiliar with that term, rules of engagement are internal rules for the military that govern like when you can use force. It can range from when an individual soldier is allowed to fire his or her weapon to when a pilot is allowed to drop bombs on a target. And so in 2017, for example, the Pentagon started letting pilots hit targets like a narcotics factory where there wasn't direct fighting happening at the moment, but suddenly it was deemed a military target. This report also points out that we think fewer troops on the ground should lead to fewer deaths from Afghans. In fact, that's not the case. So when you have fewer troops on the ground, the military has been trying to do more damage from the air, and more bombs were dropped in 2018 and 2019 than at the height of the U.S. troop presence in 2011. The report also points out, that military commanders have long known that civilian casualties are damaging to the overall war effort. The report quotes General McChrystal, who you mentioned earlier, who was the ISAF commander, expressing outrage at one incident and saying, quote, "We are going to lose this fucking war if we don't stop killing civilians." So it's crystal clear to him. So, Ben, credit to Brown for putting this together. There's less reporting on the ground there. The lower the U.S. troop levels get, the less attention I think gets paid to the war itself. There's less media who are able to operate without the protection of U.S. troops. So I think reports like this are critical to understanding how bad the reality is on the ground for the Afghan people. And, unfortunately, they also get into the fact that as we are transitioning to training the Afghan Air Force to bomb targets, they too are starting to hit civilian targets at a really alarming rate. So not great.
Yeah, and it's kind of depressing that in the Trump years, there was no expectation that they would care about civilian casualties. So what used to be an issue that got kind of scrutiny from the media, they didn't bother asking, right?
He ran on it too, right? He said he's going to bomb the shit out of them.
Yeah.
Ted Cruz, bomb into the Stone Age. It's just disgusting that that's a talking point that gets you political points. But
that's right. And I think we in this country need to look in the mirror and think, like, why is it not a bigger issue that we are killing civilians at this rate when we knew that that's exactly what was going to happen? When he said he was going to loosen the rules of engagement, well, that was clearly going to lead to civilian casualties. This is a man who bragged about dropping the quote unquote mother of all bombs, the largest conventional bomb ever dropped on a country, on Afghanistan, as if just dropping a big bomb was some achievement, and by the way, if you watch Fox, it was an achievement for years. They would cite it as part of his legacy. And at the convention, the Republican convention, you had speakers, including his grifting sons, talking about this like it was a good thing. You want to know why America is not going to win these post 9/11 wars? In part because we didn't show enough regard for the lives of the people in the countries where we'd gone to war. That's pretty straightforward. And I think this does throw up also a huge cautionary note about, the risks of shifting everything to air power. And this is why even in the counter-ISIS mission, where Obama got accused of quote unquote micromanaging the military because he put a lot of these restrictions in terms of what you could do from the air, it was always more effective to try to work with, say, the Kurds who are actually fighting ISIS on the ground. Because, again, you're not just dropping, no matter how precision-guided the weapons are, if you're dropping them from tens of thousands of feet, mistakes are more likely to happen. And these aren't just mistakes. These are tragic losses of innocent life.
Yeah. And look, there were civilian casualties under Obama. But you're right. A 330% increase because of these rule changes it's a huge deal.
It shows you why we have the rules in the first place. They do matter. They really make a difference in terms of what circumstances you're authorizing the use of lethal force.
Okay, so let's transition to Mike Pompeo, because I couldn't be more excited for him to be the former Secretary of State, but we should talk about the ways he is sort of embarrassing himself or disgracing the office on the way out the door. So first, Ben, there are concerns about irregularities in the recent Venezuelan legislative elections. The opposition boycotted these elections. They were criticized by the EU. The elections, the way they were run were, among others. But Pompeo tweeted that the elections were, quote, an attempt to steal Venezuela's democratic future and, quote, an electoral sham. And that is just humiliating for him and for the United States as he is running around supporting Trump's coup attempt, including my item number 2. Pompeo announced he is going to give a speech in Georgia. No, not Tbilisi. He's going to Atlanta. He's going to Georgia Tech a month before the runoff election. That couldn't be more partisan and more politicized. And then remember a while back when we were talking about Pompeo's, the lavish Madison dinners at the State Department for major donors and leaders. An organization called CREW, they track government corruption. Basically, they obtained documents that show that these dinners cost taxpayers at least $40,000, probably a lot more. So, I know that our punishment, Ben, is going to be watching guys like Pompeo just bang around in U.S. politics for the next few years as he plots a run for president. But, I think we need to make sure we're calling out his bullshit on the way out the door, because it's a joke. He's a joke.
He's a complete and utter joke who's debased the position of Secretary of State. eviscerated our credibility to ever comment on other countries' elections. Until we do some serious homework here in the United States. I do want to just raise one thing, Tommy, which is like, oh, he's going to Georgia. Like, fine. What is he the closer here? Like the Republicans are going to lose these 2 Senate seats, but then Mike Pompeo, like a fat, uncharismatic loser who's achieved nothing as Secretary of State, is going to come into Georgia Tech and somehow he's like the cavalry is going to deliver this win. This guy's talking about running for president. Who the fuck is going to vote for this guy for president? Like, his $40,000 on the Madison dinners. He'd be lucky if he walked out of those with 40 votes from the people who attended those dinners. So I don't even know why he's even done the service of being treated like some guy with have you seen Mike Pompeo speak? Have you listened to him? Does that sound like
compelling guy?
Like Donald Trump is compelling. Like I hate it, but he's like a charismatic guy. So like I also don't know why we go through this charade like he's this guy who needs to be taken seriously. Why? Like what has he achieved? What has he achieved in public life? Nothing. He's achieved nothing.
Petulant bully.
Yeah.
He's a petulant bully. He's just the worst. I mean, and the good news is Trump running again is going to make me completely miserable because I'm just sick of hearing him, and I'm sick of him being like the global narrator for U.S. events. But watching him freeze and infuriate all these clowns who have been looking in the mirror for 4 years and thinking they're the next president is going to be a tiny, tiny consolation prize.
Yeah, Mike Pompeo. I mean, this guy, like of all the Trump lackeys who are not related to him, like he's that got to be at the top of the list.
He's right up to the top. Okay, so here's an issue he should be working on, which is COVID. So good news. The UK is the first nation in the world to begin vaccinating its citizens. So a 90-year-old woman named Margaret Keenan was the first person in the country to get the Pfizer vaccine. A man named William Shakespeare was the second. No one tell the New York Times or we're going to get another like King Lear comparison story. But so vaccinating everyone in the UK is obviously going to take a while, especially because that version of the vaccine requires 2 doses. But light at the end of the tunnel. Good news. So that's a good news story. So now I'm going to piss you off. We also learned this week that over the summer, Pfizer offered to sell the U.S. more than the original 100 million doses of the vaccine, and the Trump administration turned them down. So that could slow down our vaccination timeline here in the U.S. over the long term and make me put my head through a wall in the short term. So that's very annoying. So let's end with some interesting context, because the most interesting thing I've read about COVID in a long time was a story by David Wallace Wells in New York Magazine, who's just a fantastic writer. He talks about how the Moderna vaccine, which is basically 95% effective, had been designed by January 13th, 2020. So this thing was like done in a lab. And the National Institute of Health was starting the process of these phase 1 trials right around the time when the first death occurred. So we've had this vaccine like in our hands for months. And I'm not saying like we should have just given it then, like obviously not, but other countries have moved faster. So China started administering its vaccine in June. Russia approved a vaccine in August. Not the countries I would normally turn to for safety standards, which is notable. So the piece asks whether we should speed up this sort of clinical trial process and potentially take a little more risk to get vaccines to market faster if that could have saved like 10, 20, 100,000 lives. And what's notable is this has happened with treatments. The FDA allowed emergency use of authorization for several treatments, including hydroxychloroquine, which one could argue makes a strong case against speeding up these processes. But it speaks to the inconsistency. So for vaccines, that phase 3 trial is there to measure efficacy and not safety. So you could make an argument for skipping that part of the process. But this piece is great because it also talks about how in the future we might be able to preemptively prepare vaccines for future pandemics in the same way that scientists anticipate the flu strain every year. So it's just worth reading the whole thing. It gets at a broader discussion that we have a lot on this show about how to manage risk with public policy and how to spend money in service of that risk and those policy choices. Because a vaccine scientist at Mount Sinai estimated that you could prepare vaccines for between 50 to 100 viruses and prepare us for the next round of pandemics for the price of the entire F-35 jet program. So a lot there, Ben. But I guess my question to you is just how you feeling about the state of the COVID world these days and how we've handled it versus the other countries.
Well, I mean, I was enraged at the news. I mean, Trump literally, his slogan is America first, drawing on his kind of fascist models from the past. And then this guy sells out Americans by not trying to acquire as much of this vaccine as possible for their quote unquote Operation Warp Speed. They basically, made it demonstrably slower and worse in terms of the dissemination of the vaccine to come by not taking this step. At the same time, you mentioned hydroxy. Like, there was no scientific impulse to test that and to put more resources behind it. That was done to kind of cover up Trump's insanity at press briefings and a narrative he wanted on Fox News, right? So, it reinforces government matters. Competent government would have saved a ton of lives in a whole host of ways, from masking to guidelines, but also now we learned vaccines. I think the bigger point here going forward is, look, this is a competence question. The national and global dissemination of these vaccines is going to be a massive effort over the course of the next year, including for the next administration. I feel so much better with just competent professionals managing this, because these are problems to be solved. These aren't ideological disputes. It's like, how do we move something from X to Y to Z? I think going forward, though, global health security was something that we were beginning to become much more invested in the Obama years, and that pandemic preparedness office that got a lot of attention, that directorate at the White House that focused on pandemic preparedness, was meant to be a part of a global system of pandemic preparedness that had U.S. offices in other countries, but also that coordinated with other countries to learn lessons from past pandemics, to be doing research, to be working together on potential vaccines. And so, yes, I do think that coming out of COVID, we should never go through this again as a global community. We should have much, much more resources devoted to early warning, to stopping the spread of outbreaks at their source, and yes, to surging resources behind vaccines and getting them to the people faster. How is this not worth the investment of, say, just the single arms sale that we'll talk about that's being made to the UAE? If you put $20 billion into global pandemic preparedness, you can save hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives if this ever happens again, and save trillions of dollars of economic damage. It is a no-brainer in terms of putting resources into this.
Yeah, and it just seems like something where you could so easily share the burden. I mean, every country in the world could put in some chunk of money, try to prepare all these vaccines, and just speed up the dissemination. It seems like the most obvious thing we could possibly do. And look, it's all enabled, I think, by this sort of new mRNA type of vaccine that's just somehow faster. I don't get it. And look, we have this legacy of, there was a version of the polio vaccine that I think got 1 in 1,000 people sick. And, the Hippocratic Oath is do no harm. So they wanted to make sure they weren't harming people here. But, there's got to be a cost benefit analysis that, I don't know, just maybe thinks about this stuff in a new way, because we're going to hit like 400,000 people dead. And we've had the formula for this vaccine since January.
There's no question, you made an important point. I cannot think of a single issue on which international cooperation should be easier, because every single country has an interest in there not being an outbreak, even in other countries, right? Because obviously, even if you get your stuff together in your own country, it can spread as long as it's spreading somewhere else. So this is something where the US and China and Europe and India and other countries that don't agree on a lot of things should all feel comfortable putting resources into the same bucket to make sure that the world can deal with this better.
If only there was an organization that dealt with World Health that we were a part of.
It was called an organization. Yeah.
There's some good place to do it. Okay, so a couple more things. So Axios had an interesting piece today that is worth reading in full about a Chinese spy who spent about 4 years in the U.S. trying to get close with various U.S. political leaders. Her primary targets were in California and the Bay Area, including Congressman Eric Swalwell, who was tapped to serve on the House Permanent Select Intelligence Committee back in 2015. So, he would have had at some point access to real information. I think she left in 2015, and there's no evidence that he ever, said anything untoward or did anything untoward. But it was just, she picked a target that later went into a position of serious influence, which is notable. But this is sort of like a long-term effort to build these ties through fundraising for politicians, networking, even romantic relationships with unnamed Midwestern mayors are mentioned in the piece. And so again, in Swalwell's case, he was warned about her, I think, by the FBI in 2015. He immediately cut ties. No allegation of any wrongdoing. But, Ben, it reminded me of the Russian illegals who spent decades in the U.S. trying to build relationships like this until they were finally exposed and given the boot from the U.S. in 2010. They later became the genesis of the show The Americans, so we thank them for that. In this case, this Chinese agent, Miss Fang, just suddenly departed in 2015, so I don't know if they got a tip somehow. it's funny. You usually think about spying and intrigue like this being a Washington thing, but the targets, again, were in San Francisco. When I lived in San Francisco, I remember noticing lots of consulates, lots of cars with diplomatic plates driving around. On top of that, there's a lot of political leaders. There's a lot of good technology to steal. So, Ben, the Axios takeaway was China is more aggressive. They're more emboldened with their spying. I'm no counterintelligence expert, but I had always just assumed that China and Russia had the pedal to the metal, but I don't know. What did you make of this piece?
Well, first of all, I'm glad you ended where you did, because I'm not a counterintelligence specialist either. What I'm about to say, I don't want to suggest is informed by, classified information I learned in government, but my instinct was that this happens all the time from lots of different countries, by the way. Obviously China and Russia, but I think lots of countries have people who report back, about business developments in other countries, obviously about politics, obviously about national security. So I think people should recognize that this kind of, human espionage is still part of the landscape. The thing that concerns me, Tommy, is that there's been a movement under Trump to kind of kick out all Chinese foreign students who are studying in this country. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of Chinese students here. And yes, there have been reports that the Chinese intelligence services have used students on an occasion like this. It would be an enormous mistake to just toss out all Chinese students because there's some spies that got through. The way to have a more airtight counterintelligence system is to just be good at uncovering who's an intelligence asset. And I can tell you, if you kick out all the Chinese students, the Chinese will find other ways to have travelers come here. You just have to be good at trying to uncover these things. You probably can't stop them all. So I do hope that the momentum of this story, which has a kind of DC salacious feel to it because it's a Chinese spy and a young woman, I hope that doesn't lead to more punitive measures against international students.
Yeah. I mean, the line between diplomat and spy is not fully spelled out here. Obviously, a sexual relationship is another level. I mean, if she is... diplomats build relationships with political leaders to get information to report back. It's called a cable.
Yeah.
I guess the line for an intel person is you're undeclared in the country, or also maybe you slip somebody a thumb drive and try to spy on their comms or something. But I mean, to your point, the Chinese are doing this all the time. The Russians, the Israelis, there's a lot of people spying on a lot of people.
We're doing it. I mean, again, I'm not revealing anything secret here, but I mean, you think the United States doesn't want to know what's happening in other countries? Of course we do.
Speaking of knowing what's happening in other places, we have to talk about aliens, because the former head of Israel's defense ministry space directorate says that aliens exist, that the U.S. has made contact with them. The aliens asked us to not go public with this news yet because the world isn't ready. He made these claims in an interview with Yediot Ahronot, which is a major Israeli newspaper. The general said the aliens are just as curious about us as we are about them. That the U.S. and the aliens have a joint underground base on Mars. Maybe the least believable part of the story is the claim that Trump was on the verge of revealing all this news, but didn't because they asked him not to prevent mass hysteria. I kind of think he's like a mass hysteria fan if it's politically advantageous. So again, for our listeners, neither of us got briefed on any alien intel, or if we did, we would lie to you about it. But it's fascinating how stories like this pop up all the time from seemingly very credible sources. You know what I mean? There's fucking Pentagon videos of UFOs flying around.
Yeah.
This dude ran Israel's defense ministry for space. And it's I don't know, if aliens exist, it's all just hiding in plain sight. And I don't know what to make of it anymore.
Harry Reid too. Have you ever heard Harry?
Yeah,
Reid?
Harry Reid.
He insists that they're UFOs, funded for years. I mean, look, to the longtime worldos, right, who've stuck with us, you'll recall that we were very supportive of the march on Area 51.
Totally.
I don't know what happened to that. I don't know why that got shut down. I know there are risks involved. I know it's hot out there, but come on. I mean, not in COVID. Everybody should be locked down, but. Sure. I mean, people need to go check out what's happening here.
Actually, marches on Area 51 were actually exempted by the LA County rules. That's a very inside LA being pissed about COVID restrictions joke.
I will say though that the Mars underground base is when you start to think that maybe this guy who was once very on top of things for Israel, that a screw would pop loose. I'm trying to envision the underground base on Mars that the U.S. has been furtively running somehow.
Right. So yeah.
How would we get there? How would we get there with no one seeing us getting there?
So I thought about this too. So the base would have had to have been built by the aliens, and we'd have to hitch a ride, I guess.
Okay, that's fair.
That's my only explanation.
So we hitch a ride on a UFO. Wait, you just no. That's so we hitch a ride on a UFO. So it's so fast that it's not picked up by telescopes and stuff.
You just stick your thumb out and you look friendly. Yeah. They haven't had the serial killers issues that we've had back here.
That's fair. That's fair.
Yeah. Anyway, last story. So Ben, your dream of winning Olympic gold has been revived. So the International Olympic Committee just announced that breakdancing, skateboarding, climbing, and surfing will make their debut at the Tokyo Games. So sadly, though, ocean rowing and parkour were rejected. But please pick your sport. Let us know how we can support you. Maybe set up a GoFundMe. We'll start your training regimen. But you just got to let us know today, like which direction you're going.
So I've got skateboarding, surfing,
breakdancing, climbing, and surfing. Now you are in Venice, so you got some ocean. I don't know how the break is, though.
I can tell you. I mean, you've been to weddings with me. I mean, I think it's a no-brainer breakdancing.
Yeah.
I mean, I could get to work. I mean, the only risk there, I would say that this would be a sure thing, except for my hamstrings. Because basically what I can see here is that like I'm going to tear muscle trying to prepare for the U.S. Olympic team on breakdancing.
You don't want to tear.
So that might suggest climbing. I don't know.
Climbing seems so hard.
Can ranting become an Olympic event?
Yeah. Okay. Well, you know what? We'll go back to them. You and I know how this Olympic thing works from our experience with Obama trying to get the games. Basically, what happens is every country goes. They make a big presentation. They do it all in good faith, trying to get the games to their city, and then a bunch of autocrats hand bags of cash to the folks in charge.
Yeah.
So,
and that's why we struck out. I did get to represent the United States. And as the official delegation to the closing ceremonies in 2012 in London, which was one of the coolest things I did in government. And it was me, Susan Rice, and Reggie Love, and Michelle Kwan, the figure skater, wonderful woman. And Reggie disappeared for very long times, usually between the end of the day and the next morning. And I think he did really well at some like casino or something. So there we were, like representing the United States. And Reggie always turned up for his duties, right? But I think he also made a little money on the side. Who knew about London casinos? Not me.
I've been reading Obama's book, and his like early campaign Reggie stories are the best. Like Obama's like the most miserable he's ever been on his life. He's like sitting on a plane with Robert Gibbs, and like, are you having any fun on this campaign trail? Obama's like, no. Reggie turned around. He goes, "If it's any consolation, I'm having the time of my life."
Which is true.
Which is true. It is the funniest thing in the world to say to the next president of the United States. But that's why everybody loves him. He's like just a beloved human being.
Yes.
All right, that's all I got for the news section.
We covered a lot of ground, Tommy. You can feel the balance shifting away from Trump, but got to get some shots in before it's too late.
It's good. I'm very excited to see Biden filling out this team. I was really excited right before we came in here to see a news report that was quoting Jake Sullivan talking about eagerness to get back into the Iran nuclear deal. Yeah, so lots of good stuff. Lots of good changes are afoot. Light at the end of the COVID tunnel. So stay tough, everybody. We'll lock down for a little while longer, mask up a little longer, and we'll make it through this thing. But see you next week.
See ya.